The diplomatic shuttle Peacekeeper drifted through the void toward the massive space station that hung like a metal moon against the stars. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, Ambassador David Reed adjusted his formal blue uniform and checked his notes one final time. Across from him sat Nina, his assistant for the past 3 years. She wore a simple gray dress and kept her hands folded in her lap, her pale eyes fixed on the viewport. "First time seeing the council station?" David asked, trying to break the heavy silence that had filled their journey. Nina turned her head slightly. "No, sir. I have been here before." Her voice was soft, almost whisper quiet. David had learned not to press her for details about her past. The woman had appeared in his office one day, with perfect credentials and a recommendation from someone high up in the diplomatic corps. She did her job flawlessly and never complained, but there was something about her that made people forget she was even in the room. The station grew larger as they approached. It was enormous, built like a wheel with 12 spokes extending from the central hub. Each spoke belonged to one of the major alien races in the Galactic Council. David could see ships from dozens of different worlds docked at various ports. Some looked like graceful birds made of crystal. Others resembled massive blocks of black metal bristling with weapons. "Attention, human vessel," came a harsh voice over the communication system. "You will dock at port 77. Any deviation from the assigned course will be considered an act of aggression." The pilot, a young man named Tom, glanced back at David with raised eyebrows. "Friendly bunch," he muttered. David sighed. This was not starting well. The message that had summoned him here had been blunt and demanding. The council wanted answers about human expansion into what they called disputed territory. 3 human colonies had been established in the past year, and apparently some of the alien races were not happy about it. The docking process took 20 minutes. During that time, David noticed several alien security teams positioning themselves around the docking bay. They carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Nina noticed them too, though she gave no outward sign. Her eyes tracked their movements with the precision of someone cataloging every detail. When the docking clamps engaged with a solid thunk, David stood and smoothed his uniform. "Ready?" he asked Nina. She nodded and gathered a small bag containing recording equipment and data tablets. "Yes, sir." The airlock hissed open, and they stepped onto the station. The artificial gravity felt slightly heavier than Earth normal, and the air had a metallic taste. A delegation of aliens waited for them, led by a tall creature with blue-gray skin and 4 arms. David recognized the species as Kelvori, known for their bureaucratic nature and love of procedure. "Ambassador Reed," the lead Kelvori said in accented but clear English. "I am Administrator Nex. You will follow me to your assigned quarters. The tribunal begins tomorrow at the 13th hour." David had expected some form of greeting, perhaps a brief welcome ceremony. Instead, he was being treated like a prisoner. "I was hoping we might have time to meet with some of the council members informally before the proceedings begin," he said. Nex's large black eyes showed no emotion. "That will not be possible. The council has voted to limit all contact until the tribunal concludes." They were escorted through corridors filled with aliens from across known space. David saw the insectoid, Vorthak with their chittering mandibles, the gas-breathing floaters in their environmental suits, and the reptilian Drakmor with their scarred hides and constant scowls. None of them looked friendly. Nina walked behind David, seeming to shrink into herself. Her posture made her appear smaller, more insignificant. Security guards and alien officials barely glanced at her as they passed. It was a talent she had, this ability to become invisible in plain sight. Their quarters were decent, but clearly temporary. 2 small rooms connected by a common area with basic furniture. The viewport showed a view of space and the nearby planet Telos, a brown and green world that served as the council's neutral meeting ground. "You will remain here except when escorted to the tribunal chamber," Nex informed them. Food will be delivered at regular intervals. Any attempt to leave without authorization will result in immediate detention. After the Kelvori left, David slumped into a chair. "Well, this is going better than expected," he said sarcastically. Nina moved to the viewport and looked out at the stars. "They are afraid," she said quietly. "Of what?" "We're just two humans on a station with thousands of aliens." "Of what humans represent." She turned from the window. 3 years ago, humanity was considered a minor species, barely worth notice. Now your colonies are expanding, your ships are faster than most alien designs, and your military has defeated every challenge. David frowned. "We're not conquerors. We're explorers. We only fight when attacked first." Nina's pale eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "That is what makes you dangerous to them. You do not seek to rule. You seek to grow. To become more than you were. They cannot understand this." Before David could respond, their first meal arrived. It was delivered by a Drakmor guard who looked like he had been carved from stone and painted dark green. His armor bore the marks of many battles, and a plasma rifle hung across his back. "Enjoy your food, humans," the guard said with a voice like grinding rocks. "It may be your last." After he left, David stared at the sealed containers of food. "Are they threatening us?" Nina opened one of the containers and examined the contents. Standard nutrition paste, the kind served to most species. "The Drakmor believe problems are solved with violence. They do not understand diplomacy." David picked at his food without appetite. Through the walls, he could hear the sounds of the massive station operating around them. Machinery hummed, footsteps echoed in corridors, and occasionally alien voices rose in what sounded like heated debate. "What do you think will happen tomorrow?" he asked. Nina was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried an odd note, something that might have been sadness. "They will try to make you submit, to accept their authority over human space. When you refuse, they will become angry. And then," she looked at him with those pale, strange eyes, "then we will see what choices they make." That night, David slept poorly. His dreams were filled with images of vast alien fleets and burning human colonies. When he woke, Nina was already awake, sitting by the viewport and watching the stars with an expression he could not read. The tribunal would begin in just a few hours. The great dome of the council chamber stretched high above like the inside of a crystal egg. Hundreds of seats arranged in concentric circles faced the center where a single podium stood under harsh white lights. David had seen pictures of this place, but being here in person made him feel very small and very human. Alien representatives filled most of the seats, their forms as diverse as the worlds they came from. The crystalline quell reflected light in rainbow patterns, while the shadow-like umbrans seemed to absorb it completely. Near the front sat the Drakmor delegation, their leader a massive warrior whose scars told stories of a dozen campaigns. Nina took a seat in the observer section, high up in the cheap seats where translators and minor officials normally sat. She had changed into an even plainer gray outfit that made her nearly invisible among the handful of other humans present. David noticed how the alien's eyes seemed to slide right past her, as if she wasn't worth their attention. Administrator next called the session to order with a device that produced a deep gong sound. The Galactic Council will now hear charges against the human species, represented by Ambassador David Reed. A Vorthak prosecutor rose from his seat, his insect-like features clicking as he spoke. The humans stand accused of unauthorized expansion into protected space, destruction of lawful patrol vessels, and violation of the Telos Accords signed by all civilized species. David had expected this. The charges were technically accurate, but ignored important context. He stood as protocol demanded and waited for permission to speak. "The accused may present his defense," Nex announced. David activated his datapad and began. "Honored council members, humanity accepts that we have expanded into regions you consider disputed. However, these actions were taken only after repeated attacks on our civilian vessels by Drakmor raiders." A rumble of angry voices rose from the Drakmor section. Their leader, General Korath, stood with his 4 arms spread wide. "Lies! Humans invaded our territory without warning or negotiation, if I may finish," David said calmly. He projected a holographic display showing ship movements over the past year. "These are the recorded paths of human cargo vessels attacked by unmarked Drakmor ships. 7 merchant vessels destroyed, over 200 civilian deaths. The hologram showed red dots where attacks had occurred, all in empty space between established territories." David continued. "We sent diplomatic messages requesting meetings to discuss these attacks. All were ignored. We established our 3 colonies only after it became clear that peaceful resolution was impossible." Several council members whispered among themselves. The evidence was clear and well documented, but David could see in their faces that facts might not matter here. A new voice spoke up from the floater section, the words coming through a translation device. "What of the destruction of our patrol fleets? 3 entire squadrons lost to human aggression." David had been waiting for this question. "Those fleets were attacking our colony ships. Our defensive forces used minimum necessary force to protect civilian lives. We sent offers of aid to rescue survivors and requested talks to prevent future incidents." "Minimum force?" General Korath's voice boomed through the chamber. "Your primitive weapons destroyed ships that have served the galaxy for centuries. Your technology threatens the balance of power." This was closer to the truth of why they were really here. David looked around the chamber and saw fear mixed with anger on many alien faces. Humanity had been expanding for less than a century, but their technology was already matching or exceeding races that had been spacefaring for millennia. "We have always been willing to share our innovations through peaceful trade," David said. "Our colonies have standard markets where any species can purchase human goods legally, at prices that undercut established suppliers," hissed a serpentine representative. "Your efficiency damages traditional commerce." David felt a moment of frustration. They were being put on trial for being too successful, too quick to adapt. "Competition benefits everyone through lower prices and better products. This is basics. Economics." The chamber erupted in angry voices. Many species had grown comfortable with their established roles in galactic society. Humanity's rapid advancement threatened those comfortable arrangements. Nina watched from her high seat as the debate grew more heated. Her pale eyes tracked the movements of security guards around the chamber's perimeter. They wore the insignia of multiple species, supposedly neutral peacekeepers. But she noticed how they positioned themselves, how their weapons were oriented, how their formation would allow them to cover all exits. Administrator Nex called for order with several gong strikes. "The council will now deliberate. Ambassador Reed, you will wait in the adjacent chamber while we reach our decision." David was escorted to a small room with a single chair and no windows. 2 guards remained outside the door. He could hear the muffled sounds of debate from the main chamber, but could not make out individual words. Hours passed. David tried to remain calm, but the isolation and uncertainty wore at his nerves. Finally, the door opened and Nex appeared. "The council has reached its decision. You will return to hear our judgment." Back in the great chamber, David noticed the mood had grown darker. Many seats that had been filled earlier were now empty, and the remaining aliens watched him with expressions ranging from hostility to what might have been pity. Nina was still in her observer seat, sitting perfectly still with her hands in her lap. Something about her posture had changed, though David could not say exactly what. She seemed more alert, more focused. Administrator Nex stood at the central podium. The Galactic Council finds the human species guilty of aggressive expansion and disruption of galactic peace. We offer the following terms for resolution. David's heart sank. He had hoped reason might prevail. First, all human colonies in disputed territories must be evacuated within 1 standard year. Second, human expansion beyond currently recognized. Borders is forbidden. Third, human technology exports will be limited and regulated by council oversight. Fourth, humanity will pay reparations for all ships and personnel lost in recent conflicts. The terms were deliberately harsh, designed to cripple human growth and independence. David knew his government would never accept them. If these terms are rejected, Nex continued, the Council reserves the right to enforce them through military action. David stood slowly. He had known this moment might come, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "I will convey these terms to my government," he said formally, "but I believe you already know what their response will be." General Korath stood with a grin that showed far too many teeth. "Then we will have the war we have been preparing for. Human, your species will learn to respect your betters." In her high seat, Nina's fingers twitched slightly. The movement was so small that no one noticed except perhaps the shadows themselves. The tribunal was over, but something much more dangerous was about to begin. The morning of the second day brought an unexpected change in protocol. Instead of being confined to their quarters, David and Nina were escorted to a smaller meeting room adjacent to the main chamber. Administrator Nex explained that several council members wished to hear additional testimony before final judgment was rendered. "I thought the decision was already made," David said as they walked through corridors filled with more security guards than before. "There are always complications in matters of such importance," Nex replied cryptically. The meeting room was circular with a raised platform in the center. Only about 50 alien representatives were present, but David recognized several key figures, including General Korath and the Vorthak prosecutor. Nina took a seat in the back row, her gray clothing making her blend into the shadows between the harsh lighting panels. David stepped onto the central platform as requested. The aliens arranged around him seemed more aggressive than before, leaning forward in their seats like predators watching prey. "Ambassador Reed," began the Vorthak prosecutor, "yesterday you claimed your actions were defensive. We have new evidence that suggests otherwise." A holographic display activated, showing what appeared to be recordings from Drakmor military ships. The images were grainy, but seemed to show human vessels firing first in several encounters. "These recordings are fabricated," David said immediately. "Our own sensor logs clearly show the Drakmor ships initiated combat in every case." General Korath rose to his feet, his massive frame casting a shadow across the platform. "You call the military records of the Drakmor Empire lies? I call them edited to support a predetermined conclusion," David replied firmly. "If you examine the timestamps and energy signatures, the manipulation becomes obvious." The general's forearms spread wide in a gesture of mock surprise. "Such accusations from a species that has existed in space for barely a century. Perhaps you need a lesson in respect." Something in the alien's tone made David's blood run cold. This was not going according to diplomatic protocol. The other aliens in the room were standing now, their postures aggressive and hostile. Nina remained seated, but her pale eyes were tracking movement around the room with the precision of a computer calculating trajectories. She noticed how the guards had quietly repositioned themselves to block all exits. She saw weapons being shifted from peaceful to ready positions. She observed the subtle signals being passed between different alien groups. "General Korath," David said, trying to maintain diplomatic calm. "If there are concerns about the evidence, I suggest we arrange for neutral parties to examine all records. The truth will speak for itself." The Drakmor general laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "The time for talk is over, human. You and your kind need to learn that. The galaxy belongs to those strong enough to hold it." That was when David noticed the guards raising their weapons. energy weapons designed to stun and kill, all pointed directly at him. His small security detail of 3 human Marines reached for their sidearms, but they were vastly outnumbered. "What is the meaning of this?" David demanded, though he already knew the answer. "This tribunal was never about justice," General Korath said with satisfaction. "It was about sending a message to your species. When your government finds your body, they will understand that humans are not welcome among the civilized races, the Chiu." First shots came from multiple directions at once. David's security team managed to return fire for perhaps 3 seconds before being cut down by overwhelming force. Energy bolts filled the air with brilliant flashes of light and the smell of ozone. David felt the first blast hit his chest like a hammer blow. His diplomatic vest had some protection, but it was designed to stop small arms, not military-grade weapons. A second shot spun him around, and a third dropped him to his knees. As his vision began to blur, David saw the aliens cheering or nodding with satisfaction. They had gotten what they wanted. A clear message of dominance sent at the cost of diplomatic protocol and galactic law. But in his fading consciousness, David also noticed something else. Nina was no longer in her seat. She had risen during the first moments of the attack, moving with fluid grace that seemed to slow time around her. Where moments before had sat a forgettable woman in gray clothing, now stood something that made the air itself feel colder. The temperature in the room began to drop, though none of the aliens noticed immediately. They were too busy congratulating themselves on their successful execution. General Korath was giving orders to his troops about disposing of the bodies and preparing official statements. Nina stepped down from the observer section with movements that were too smooth, too controlled. Her footsteps made no sound on the metal flooring. Several aliens glanced in her direction, but their eyes seemed to slide away, unable to focus on her properly. "Attention," she said in the same quiet voice she had always used as David's assistant. The word carried across the room despite being spoken softly. Conversations stopped. Weapons lowered slightly as heads turned toward the sound. Nina stood at the edge of the central platform where David lay motionless. Her pale eyes surveyed the room with the detached interest of someone examining insects. Under glass. "You have made an error," she continued in that same calm tone. General Korath looked at her with confusion and growing irritation. "Who is this human female? How did she get past security?" "I am Nina," she replied simply. "I have served as Ambassador Reed's assistant for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. In that time, he treated me with kindness and respect. He was a good man who believed in peace between species." Some of the aliens began to laugh. Others looked annoyed at the interruption. A few of the older, more experienced representatives began backing toward the exits with expressions of growing concern. "He came here to prevent war," Nina said, her voice still quiet but somehow carrying more weight with each word. "He offered compromise. He sought understanding. He was willing to sacrifice human interests for the sake of peace." The temperature continued to drop. Frost began forming on metal surfaces, though it seemed to avoid Nina entirely. General Korath raised his weapon toward her. "Enough of this nonsense. Kill the female and dispose of both bodies." Nina turned her pale eyes toward him with interest. "You chose murder over diplomacy, violence over peace, death over life." She tilted her head slightly like a child examining a particularly interesting toy. "I am curious to see how that choice serves you." The first Drakmor guard who fired at her discovered that his energy bolt simply vanished before reaching its target, swallowed by shadows that seemed to gather around. Nina like living things. That was when the screaming began. The first guard who fired at Nina watched his energy bolt disappear into nothingness, swallowed by shadows that seemed to bend light around her small frame. His confusion lasted exactly 2 seconds before Nina appeared beside him with impossible speed. Her hand touched his throat with gentle precision. The massive Drakmor warrior, bred for combat and enhanced with military augmentations, simply stopped. His heart ceased beating, his nervous system went quiet, and he fell to the floor with the soft sound of armor hitting metal. "Energy weapons," Nina said conversationally, as if she were still taking notes in a diplomatic meeting. "Interesting choice for an execution. Clean, efficient, minimal cleanup required." The other guards opened fire, filling the air with deadly light. But Nina was no longer where their weapons pointed. She moved between the bolts like water flowing around stones, her gray dress somehow untouched by the violence around her. General Korath bellowed orders in his native language, but his words came out as terrified squeaks. Something primal in his warrior brain recognized a predator far beyond his ability to fight. He watched one of his best soldiers reach for Nina, only to have his arm simply separate from his body at her touch. "You should not have done this," Nina said, her voice carrying across the chaos with perfect calm. A Vorthak representative tried to flee toward the exit, only to find Nina somehow already there, waiting for him with patient eyes. "Please," the insectoid alien chittered through his translator. "I only voted as ordered. I bear no personal malice toward humans." Nina considered this with the same expression she had worn while reviewing David's diplomatic correspondence. "You were present when they planned his murder. You watched him die. You felt satisfaction at his death." Her pale hand moved toward the alien's thorax with surgical precision. "These things matter." The Vorthak's screams cut off abruptly as his nervous system forgot how to function. Across the room, the few truly ancient species present began exhibiting behaviors their younger colleagues could not understand. The Eternal Watchers, being so old they remembered the first stars being born, pressed themselves against the walls and whispered prayers in languages that predated most civilizations. One of the void touched entities that had survived the heat, death of previous universes, looked at Nina with something approaching recognition. "Old One," it spoke in a voice like cosmic wind. "We did not know you walked among the young races." Nina paused in her work long enough to acknowledge the ancient, being with a slight nod. "I have found their company educational. We meant no disrespect to your chosen ward." "I know," Nina replied. "You may leave." The void-touched entity departed through a wall, simply stepping sideways out of normal space. The Eternal Watchers followed through more conventional exits, their movements urgent with ancient fear. The younger aliens watched this exchange with growing terror. If beings older than their entire civilizations feared this small human woman, what exactly were they facing? General Korath tried to rally his remaining troops. "It is just one being! Concentrate fire! Bring heavy weapons!" His soldiers tried to comply, but Nina was already among them. She moved with the kind of grace that suggested physical laws were merely suggestions she chose to follow or ignore. A Drakmor sergeant aimed his plasma cannon directly at her center, mass, and fired. The bolt struck Nina squarely in the chest and vanished without effect, absorbed into whatever she truly was beneath her human appearance. She looked down at the point of impact with mild interest, then back at the soldier. "That was rude," she observed. The sergeant had time to register her words before his existence simply ended. Not death as most species understood it, but a complete cessation of being. Where he had stood was now empty space, as if he had never existed at all. Nina turned her attention back to General Korath, who was backing away with all four arms raised in what might have been surrender or prayer. "You planned this for weeks," she said, walking toward him with unhurried steps. "You convinced the others that murder was preferable to negotiation. You felt pride when you gave the order to fire. I was following orders," the general stammered. "The council voted. It was not my decision alone." "No," Nina agreed. "But you were enthusiastic about it. You wanted to see him suffer before he died." Her pale eyes fixed on him with the weight of galaxies behind them. "You succeeded in that goal. He did suffer," He died believing he had failed to prevent a war between our species. General Korath tried to run, but his legs would not obey him. He found himself paralyzed, able only to watch as Nina approached with her terrible patience. "Please," he whispered. "I have younglings, a mate. They need me." David had people who cared for him too, Nina replied. A sister who worried about his dangerous job, colleagues who respected his dedication to peace, children on distant colonies who learned about diplomacy from his example. She reached out with one pale hand and placed it gently on the general's massive forehead. "They will mourn him. They will wonder if they could have done something to save him. They will carry guilt that belongs to you." General Korath felt cold spreading through his body, but it was not the cold of death. It was something far worse. "What are you doing to me?" "Teaching you about consequences," Nina said softly. "You will live. You will return to your empire and tell them what happened here. But you will carry the weight of every being who dies in the war you helped start. Every human death. Every alien death. Every destroyed world. You will feel them all as if you pulled the trigger yourself." The general's eyes widened in horror as he understood. Death would have been mercy compared to what she was offering. Nina released him and stepped back. "Run along now, General. You have reports to file." Around the room, the surviving aliens, who had not fled, watched in stunned silence as their most feared military leader stumbled toward the exit, tears streaming down his scarred face. Nina looked around at the remaining witnesses with the same mild expression she had worn while serving. "Coffee at diplomatic meetings. The rest of you may go as well. Tell your governments what you have seen here. Explain to them that humanity offered peace, and you chose war." As the aliens fled in panic, Nina knelt beside David's still form and placed a gentle hand on his forehead. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, and something that might have been grief flickered across her features. "Sleep well, Ambassador," she whispered. "Your duty is done." The chamber fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems, struggling to clear the smell of fear and death from the air. The great council station fell into chaos as word of the massacre spread through its corridors. Emergency protocols activated, sealing sections and trapping thousands of aliens inside, while security forces tried to understand what had happened. In the tribunal chamber, Nina stood alone among the bodies, her gray dress somehow still clean, despite the violence that had surrounded her. The room temperature had returned to normal, but frost still lingered on the walls like memories of winter. She knelt beside David's body and closed his eyes with gentle fingers. "You believed in them," she said quietly to his still form. "Even after they betrayed you, you hoped they might choose wisdom over fear. That was your greatest strength and your fatal weakness." Emergency teams finally breached the sealed chamber doors, expecting to find a war zone. Instead, they discovered something far more disturbing. The human diplomat lay peacefully in the center of the room while his assistant sat calmly in a nearby chair, her pale eyes reflecting the harsh emergency lighting. "Medical teams to the council chamber immediately," someone shouted over the communication systems. "We have multiple casualties and survivors in shock." Nina watched with mild interest as alien medics rushed past her to examine the fallen. They worked frantically over some bodies, checking for signs of life and administering emergency treatment. Others they simply covered with sheets after brief examinations revealed causes of death that made no medical sense. A young Kelvori security officer approached Nina cautiously, his forehands shaking as he held a recording device. "Miss Nina, is it? I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." She turned those pale, strange eyes toward him with the same polite attention she had always given David's requests. "Of course, officer. How may I help you?" "The witnesses who escaped claim that you killed these beings with your bare hands. Is this accurate?" Nina considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she had once applied to scheduling diplomatic meetings. Some of them died, yes, others simply stopped existing. There is a difference, though I understand the distinction might be difficult for younger species to appreciate. The officer's translator struggled with some of her words, producing confused beeps and static. What do you mean by stopped? Existing? General Korath could explain it to you, Nina replied helpfully, though I suspect he is currently occupied with more pressing matters. In his private quarters 3 levels below, General Korath was indeed occupied. He sat hunched over a communication terminal, trying to compose a report for his superiors, while tears he could not control streamed down his scarred face. Every few minutes, waves of guilt and anguish would crash over him as he felt the phantom. Deaths of beings who had not yet died. Casualties of a war that had not yet begun. Back in the chamber, more security teams arrived along with investigators from multiple species. They set up scanning equipment and began documenting the scene, though their instruments provided more questions than answers. The energy readings make no sense, muttered a Quell technician, her crystalline form flickering with confused colors. Some of these deaths show massive neural disruption, but there are no corresponding weapon signatures. Others show complete cellular breakdown at the quantum level. Nina remained patient as investigators asked her the same questions in different ways, trying to understand how a small human female had somehow killed dozens of armed aliens without apparent weapons or technology. Her answers were always polite but rarely helpful. "You claim you are Ambassador Reed's assistant," said the lead investigator, an elderly floater whose environmental suit bore the insignia of the Council's Justice Division. "What are your qualifications for this position?" "I have extensive experience in diplomatic protocols and interspecies relations," Nina replied. "I am also quite good at taking dictation and organizing filing systems. Our records show no background information for you prior to 3 years ago, no birth records, education history, or previous employment." Nina tilted her head slightly as if the question itself was interesting. "Records can be incomplete. Memory is often unreliable. Identity is more complex than most beings realize." The investigator tried a different approach. "Several witnesses claim you displayed abilities beyond normal human parameters. Can you explain this?" "Humans are often underestimated," Nina said with what might have been a smile. "Your species has made this error repeatedly throughout history. Perhaps it is time to update your assumptions." Hours passed as the investigation continued, but Nina never changed her story or lost her composure. When asked directly if she had killed the aliens in the room, she would neither confirm nor deny it. When pressed about her true nature, she would politely redirect the conversation back to David's diplomatic mission. Finally, Administrator Nex himself arrived to take control of the situation. The Kelvori bureaucrat looked older than his centuries, worn down by the unprecedented crisis that had engulfed his station. "Miss Nina," he said formally, "by order of the Emergency Council session, you are to be placed in protective custody while we determine the appropriate response to these events." Nina stood and smoothed her gray dress. "Will I be allowed to attend Ambassador Reed's funeral? He deserves proper honors for his service." Nex blinked all 4 of his large eyes in confusion. We have not yet determined protocols for handling his remains. There are questions of jurisdiction and—" "He will be buried on Earth," Nina said with quiet authority that cut through the bureaucrat's stammering. "With full diplomatic honors. I will ensure this happens." "You are not in a position to make demands," Nex replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Nina looked at him with those pale eyes that seemed to hold depths no one wanted to explore. "Administrator Nex, in the past 6 hours, you have lost 43 council members, including your most influential military leader. Your station is in lockdown, your security forces are terrified, and your member species are demanding explanations. You cannot provide. She stepped closer to the administrator, her small frame somehow making him feel very small. I am not making demands. I am informing you of what will happen. Nex tried to maintain his official composure, but something in her presence made his survival instincts scream warnings. And if we refuse? Nina's expression remained politely interested. Then you will discover why humanity's diplomats travel with such unusual assistance. The administrator quickly authorized the release of David's body to human custody. Within hours, a human naval vessel arrived to collect their fallen ambassador and his mysterious aide. Nina boarded the ship without incident, carrying only the small bag she had brought to the station. As the human ship prepared to depart, Nina stood at a porthole looking back at the council station. To the few aliens watching her leave, she appeared to be just another grieving human returning home with sad news. But in the depths of space around the station, older things stirred. Ancient beings who had slept for eons began to wake, drawn by the echoes of power that had been unleashed in that tribunal chamber. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear, and a few out of something that might have been respect. The message Nina had intended to send was clear across the galaxy. Humanity offered friendship to those who met them with honor. But for those who chose treachery and murder, something far older than civilization itself walked among the humans, and it kept very careful accounts. 3 days later, the news reached Earth through official channels. Ambassador David Reed had been killed during a terrorist attack on the council station. 43 alien representatives had also died in the incident. The perpetrators remained unknown, though investigations were ongoing. Nina attended David's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, standing quietly in the back, while government officials and diplomats delivered speeches about his dedication to peace. She wore the same gray dress and maintained the same invisible presence that had served her so well throughout her time as his assistant. After the ceremony, she was approached by Director Collins, the head of the diplomatic corps. He was a thin man with worried eyes who had personally recruited David for the council mission. Miss Nina, he said carefully, there are some questions about what exactly happened on that station. The alien reports are contradictory. People often remember traumatic events differently, Nina replied, with the same helpful tone she had always used with David's correspondence. Shock can affect memory in various ways. Director Collins studied her face, searching for something he could not name. Will you be returning to diplomatic service? Your record with Ambassador Reed was exemplary. Nina considered this question while watching the honor guard fold the flag that had covered David's coffin. I think my work in that field is complete. Ambassador Reed was a good teacher, but the lessons he valued most seem to be in short supply these days. What will you do now? For the first time since Collins had known her, Nina smiled. It was not an entirely human expression. I believe I will travel for a while. There are other places where such lessons might be appreciated. Within a week, reports began filtering in from across known space. The Drakmor Empire had recalled all their fleets to defensive positions and canceled all expansion plans. The Vorthic hegemony was offering unprecedented trade concessions to human colonies. 3 species that had never shown interest in humanity were sending diplomatic missions to Earth with gifts and treaties. More disturbing were the stories that came through unofficial channels. Drakmor warriors spoke in whispers of General Korath, who had returned from the council station as a broken shell of his former self. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally weeping for reasons he could not explain to anyone, including himself. On the Vorthak homeworld, the prosecutor who had presented the false evidence against humanity was found in his chambers, catatonic and unresponsive. Medical examination revealed nothing wrong with his body, but his mind seemed to have simply stopped processing reality. The few surviving witnesses from the tribunal chamber told stories that made no sense to investigators. They spoke of a human woman who moved like shadow and spoke with the voice of winter. They described deaths that followed no known biological or physical principles. Most importantly, they all carried the same message. Humanity had sent a diplomat who offered peace and compromise. When that diplomat was murdered in violation of every law and custom of civilized species, something had emerged from among the humans that made their greatest weapons look like children's toys. The message was received and understood across the galaxy. Humanity might appear young and vulnerable, but they walked with companions that made the oldest species step aside with respect and fear. Back on Earth, Nina disappeared as quietly as she had first appeared in David's office 3 years earlier. Her personnel files became mysteriously corrupted, her apartment was found empty with no forwarding address, and her few personal possessions seemed to have never existed. But in the IE, halls of human government, a new policy was quietly implemented. All future diplomatic missions to potentially hostile species would travel with assistants whose backgrounds were never questioned and whose true nature was better left unexplored. The galaxy had learned that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their weapons, but their ability to earn the loyalty of things that existed beyond the understanding of younger races. And in the cold depths between stars, ancient entities that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations nodded with approval. The humans had chosen their protectors well.